Chapter 20. Dre. Panic. As soon as they exited the dungeon, the encirclement of the defiled humans broke, leaving a path towards freedom. It was a trick. Dre knew that it was, but even so he sprinted forward, Asya still in his arms. Maybe if he was quick enough, then he could escape whatever cruelty the monstrous dungeon-bound had prepared for them. He was thus entirely confused when his once victims and now captors made no effort to stop him. He kept sprinting, though, his heart racing, until he was more than 100 paces from the dungeon entrance. He turned then, fully expecting to see a horde of diseased rat gore chasing him. What he saw was even more startling. Nothing. There weren't any creatures behind them. They weren't being chased. It appeared that even their escort had returned to the depths of the dungeons because not a single misshapen monster could be seen. Dre's breath turned shaky as relief flooded him. He could feel tears building in the corner of his eyes, but he couldn't let them fall. He didn't have time for such a luxury. He glanced down as he started to run through the dead forest around him. Asya lay nearly motionless in his arms. He liked to think that he could see a slight rise and fall to her chest, or her heartbeat throbbing visibly through a vein on her neck, but part of him feared that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. She hadn't moved since they had exited the massive cavern, and the terrors housed there. He hoped that her exhausted, injured body was finally allowing her to rest, but he didn't know. He wasn't a healer. He couldn't do anything for her directly. So he did the one thing that was within his power, the one thing that might just save her, that might just save himself. He ran. He ran to bring Asya to healer Norley. He ran to escape to escape Tega. He ran to distance himself from his sins. Dre knew that in his panic-induced high, he could not possibly comprehend the price that he had paid for their lives. No, he would not know the full price until the first nightmare, the first sleepless night, the inevitable lies and secrets. He wondered what Adian thought of him now. It was inconceivable that the field musician would still want him to be part of his adventuring team. Not after he had murdered the final member of his old squad. Dre was not a religious man, but he couldn't help but wonder what Adian's God, the Creator, thought of him now. He probably wasn't real, but what if he was? Dre broke himself free of his internal musings when he finally made it back to the main road. Instead of wasting even more energy on useless thoughts, he poured every drop of effort he had into running faster and faster. He ignored the fire in his lungs and leaden weights that seemed to be strapped to his legs. His arms no longer ached. After carrying Asya for so long, he couldn't even feel them. Dre had no doubt that he would have collapsed long ago, if not for the modifications his class had made to his body. But as exhaustion dragged at him, the improvements didn't feel like enough. He entered the westerly edge of Neridni at a breathless sprint, ignored the concerned shouts that rang out around him, and made a beeline for the small white building in the center of the town. He barged into the infirmary, shouted for healer Norley, and laid Asya gently in one of the empty beds. He stood there, looking at her for a single heartbeat, before, in a rush, all of his strength abandoned him, and he collapsed to the ground in a trembling heap. His mind flirted with unconsciousness as healer Norley rushed into the room, her voice raised in righteous indignation. Her words were cut short by a horrified gasp, followed by a moment of frozen silence. Then the woman sprang into action, but Dre's blurry vision and addled mind couldn't keep up with her frenetic pace. He laid there as the healer worked, unable to muster the strength or motivation to move. What little energy he did have was used in a fruitless attempt to stem the never-ending tide of questions that poured out of the woman. But even when he did manage to string together enough words to form a coherent sentence, his truthful answers were too unbelievable to be interpreted as anything but nonsense. Ultimately, the woman abandoned her questioning as she shifted her attention fully to the intricacies of her work. Dre's body desperately needed rest, and yet his fear for Asya made him cling to what scraps of awareness he had left. His internal struggle ended in a stalemate where his mind floated in the limbo between consciousness and oblivion as the world blurred around him. He was unable to fathom how long he stayed like that, before 10 horrible words dragged him back into merciless reality. "There is internal bleeding. She isn't going to make it." The words struck him like a stamina-infused lightning bolt. What? No! Asya had to live. She just had to. Even Tega had said she would. She had to live. She just had to. There was no other acceptable outcome. He leapt to his feet as his exhaustion was alchemized into a desperate, reckless energy. "Give her a healing potion," Dre shouted, causing healer Norley and Asya's parents, whom he hadn't even realized were in the room, to jump in surprise. They all stared at him with startled expressions for a heartbeat before their faces once again turned somber. Healer Norley looked like she had 100 questions for Dre, but she didn't ask any of them. "There is none left," she whispered. Dre shook his head. "But that can't be right. Astia told me that you still had a potion left, even after the bear attack a couple of months back." Norley's brow knit into consternation. I did this morning, but I used it. I used all of it. I shouldn't have, but the girl was in so much pain, and that fool of a bard made me question." The healer's head dropped, and as she stared at the floor, Jay was nearly at a loss for words. He had never seen the healer so distraught, but that didn't matter right now. Dre turned away from the healer and towards Asya. She lay there, wrapped in white bandages. He would have thought her to be sleeping peacefully if not for her pale skin and labored breathing. Even still, it didn't seem reasonable that she was on death's door in this sterile, tranquil place, not after the hell that they had just managed to escape from. He bent down and slowly kissed her on the center of her feverish forehead. She couldn't die. She just couldn't. Dre wouldn't let it happen. He jumped upright and dashed out of the room. He ignored the startled noises from behind him and was out of the door of the healer's home in mere moments. He sprinted across the town and crashed through the doors of a small shop. "I need a healing potion, now!" he shouted with all the breath left in him. But instead of being confronted by the gangly, perennially sneering alchemist, Lucia, his newly acquired apprentice, stared at the panting, filth-covered Dre in startled disgust. "Dre?" she questioned, her squeaky voice sounding more like a bird's call than human speech. "What's going on?" Dre ignored her question. "Do you have one?" Lucia's face contorted in confusion. "Have what?" Dre exhaled a frustrated sigh. "A healing potion. I need one for Asya." The young woman gasped. "Oh no! What happened? Is she all right? Have you taken her to see Healer Norley? Why did—" Dre cut her off. "There isn't time for your incessant questions, Lucia. Do you have a potion or not?" Lucia's expression grew stony, and she replied in a clipped tone. "No, we don't. You know that we don't. We only make perishable potions to order. I actually delivered one early today." "Where did you deliver it?" Dre growled. "I can't tell you that," Lucia squeaked. "It's like alchemist Parlu always says. Half of what our clients pay us for is an anonymity." "I can't tell you that," Lucia squeaked. "It's like alchemist Parul always says. Half of what our clients pay us for is anonymity." She began to giggle. "You would not believe some of the things requested. This one time—" Dre cut her off as he slammed both fists onto the counter. "Asya might die, and you're worried about confidentiality? Where in this creator-forsaken town did you deliver that potion?" Dre immediately regretted losing his temper as tears sprang easily into Lucia's wide eyes. She sniffed slightly and lowered her gaze as she meekly replied, "I'm sorry, but I can't tell you. I took an oath, but—" She looked up and hesitated. "It's expensive, and we haven't had the chance to replenish our stock of herbs since making the last one." She hesitated again. "But I could try and make a healing potion for you." Dre saw his chance, and he took it. After a short but desperate negotiation filled with a confusing mixture of pleading and bullying, he burst out of the alchemist's shop, which now had a large pile of collateral littering its lobby. He sprinted towards the nearest trees that he could see, a list of plant description grasped in his hand, and a seed of hope stirring in his heart. "Dre? Dre? Are you out here?" "Dre, son, where are you?" "I swear, Dre, if you don't respond right now, I'm banishing you from our home forever." "Like that is going to help, darling." "Well, we haven't tried threats yet." "The list of things we haven't tried is long, and threats aren't at the top of it." "Let's stay focused, please. He has to be out here somewhere. This is the direction that the silly alchemist's apprentice saw him run, after all." "Do you really think that guitar of yours is helping? It's quieter than our shouts." Dre slowly awoke to the sounds of muffled conversation rising above a guitar strumming a familiar tune, with familiar, revitalizing effect. He sat up quickly as panicked questions poured into his sluggish mind, only to be forced back down by massive vertigo as the world spun around him, his head filled with an all-consuming pain. After a few heartbeats, the pain retreated, and he gently touched a large bump in the center of his forehead. It felt like he had the egg of a giant shield eagle shoved under his skin. He sat up again, though much more slowly this time. The lump on his head still throbbed with the motion, but thankfully it wasn't accompanied by any dizziness. Dre carefully looked around and saw that he was sitting at the base of a large tree, surrounded by the usual undergrowth of spring. He noticed a low branch that stuck out at what seemed to be his head height and guessed that he had discovered the culprit responsible for the pain he was experiencing. From the angle of the sun's rays, Dre assumed that it had to be around midday. He had been fruitlessly searching well into the darkness of night, but even still, he must have been unconscious for almost half a day. He tried to call out, but his throat was parched, and all that came out was a weak croak. So he sat there and attempted to create some saliva to moisten his throat, but it was to no avail. The voices and guitar were starting to fade. They must be traveling away from him. He looked around himself in a panic and saw some sticks lying close to him. He picked them up and started smacking them together as hard as he could. The loud thwacking caused a sharp pain in his head, but he forced through the pain until the sticks broke. Thankfully, it was enough. The voices were once again growing louder. In a matter of moments, they were accompanied by the sound of cracking branches and footsteps rustling through the underbrush. Adian suddenly appeared from behind a sprouting bush, followed quickly by his mother and father. When they actually caught sight of him, they screamed and sprinted to him. Dre could barely see them, though, his vision blurring with tears. Within moments, his mother was kneeling at his side. "What's wrong, my love?" she asked, and Dre responded with a croak as he rubbed his hands over his throat. She looked around. "I don't have anything to drink." Adian spoke up even as he continued to play his guitar. "Dre, there should be water skins in your pack." Dre felt at his back and realized that he still had his pack on. He hadn't had his pack for very long, but already it felt like a part of him. Ever since he got the reduced weight and encumbered balance skills, he was forgetting it was there more and more, even with its substantial weight. It felt more like a part of himself than something he was carrying. He reached his hand back into its strange opening and pulled out a water flask, to startled gasps from his parents. He took a couple of small sips to wet his throat, and then a few large gulps before his father pulled it away from him. "Don't overdo it, Dre. I've seen thirsty men make themselves sick with too much water." Dre couldn't help but smile up at his father. His words of advice were familiar and comforting, but as his mind became clearer and clearer, his smile faded. His mind fixated on a singular name. "Is Asi all right? I wasn't able to get all the ingredients and... He felt at the egg-shaped lump on his head again. "I must have hit my head, but Healer Norley said that she was dying and that she needed a healing potion, but the alchemist didn't have any potions and I wasn't sure what to do." "Hush, darling," his mother said as she sat on the ground next to him and grabbed his hand. "Asia is going to be all right, I promise." Dre's heart lifted at the words, but he didn't understand. "How?" he asked. His mother gave him a bemused smile. "Well, it's a miracle, really. We ran straight to the healers when we heard about Asia's condition. We were comforting her parents as she slowly faded away when your friend, the bard over there," she gestured to an aggrieved Adian, "arrived asking after you and Asia. When he saw and heard of her near-death state, he immediately rushed out." She looked back and forth between Dre and Adian. "You both do that quite a lot, you know," she said in that reproachful and yet loving way that only mothers can pull off, then continued. "He rushed out, but in almost no time at all he rushed back in, and somehow the only healing potion in the entire town was in his hands. Healer Norley used the whole thing on Asia at Adian's direct request. She is now well on her way to recovery." His mother hesitated. "At least, physically she is. But she is definitely still traumatized by whatever took place." His mother looked at him, and the unspoken question hung tensely between them. But it was a question that he couldn't answer. He shuddered as horrible memories flooded his mind. He thought of all the death, terror, and betrayal. He shook his head. Even the thought of broaching the topic with his parents was overwhelming. "I can't talk about it. I'm sorry, but I really can't. Not right now." Her expression grew mournful as she looked at him, but thankfully she didn't press. Dre turned his attention to Adian, and tears once again began building in the corners of his eyes. "Thank you for what you did for Asia. I know that healing potions are incredibly expensive. I will do whatever I can to repay you." Adian shook his head vigorously. "Stop it," he said firmly. "You saved my life. If anything, I was just paying down a portion of that debt." Dre looked at his parents and then down at the ground. "We both know that whatever goodwill I deserve for saving your life was greatly overshadowed by other actions that I chose to take in the dungeon." There was silence for a few moments as Dre continued to stare at the ground, then for a few moments more, and then a few more, until the silence had grown stale and uncomfortable. When Dre finally looked up, he saw confusion and sympathy from his mother, and mostly just confusion from his father. Adian's expression was more complex. There was frustration, confusion, sorrow, and sadness. And Dre wasn't sure if it was simply wishful thinking. There might just be a little understanding there as well. As Dre looked at him, Adian spoke. His words were quiet, but they burned with an underlying fire. Perhaps your recent actions have left you in a moral debt to the Creator. Perhaps not. Our actions in chaotic and desperate situations can't be judged in the same way as the choices we are given the luxury to consciously make. I can't confidently say that I would have made better or even different choices, but I saw the things you did, and I doubt I'll ever forget it. Perhaps I can forgive it, but either way, I still owe you my life. I wouldn't have ever made it out of there without you. Surely what I did shifts the scales of debt towards me. Adian's face twitched, but his earnest expression never changed. We both know that someone else is responsible for their deaths. If a drunk throws a stool in a tavern and it crushes my guitar, should I take up a grievance with the stool or with the drunk? Dre slowly nodded, as he tried to align his emotions with the logic of Adian's words. But his feelings wouldn't budge. I get your point, but I doubt you would like that stool very much afterwards. Adian shook his head slowly, as a small, almost sad grin snuck onto his face. Maybe not. But either way, the stool doesn't owe me a healing potion. Dre returned Adian's sad smile. Okay, he said, before turning to look at his parents, who looked more confused than ever. Let's get moving. Adian turned, and after a moment's hesitation, he picked a direction and started slowly walking as he played. Dre was surprised to realize that Adian hadn't stopped playing since they had found him, and Dre had barely noticed. When he had first daydreamed about joining Adian's team, he had wondered if it would be odd to always have a backdrop of music, but maybe it was just something that you got used to. Not that teaming up seemed all that likely now. His parents walked up on either side of him, and his father hesitantly rested a hand lightly on his shoulder. I didn't follow that conversation, but it sounds like you went through a lot, son. I just want you to know that your mother and I are here for you, and we always will be. Dre nodded in acknowledgement, even though for some reason he couldn't make himself believe the reassuring words. His father wiped something out of his eye and cleared his throat gruffly. Anyways, that pack of yours is something. I can only assume it's connected to your new class. It looks like you won't need that cart when making deliveries anymore. Dre looked between his father and mother, and then slowly shook his head. Despair nearly engulfed him when he thought of the wretched things that he would one day be forced to tell them. But not right now. Instead, he told them something that would hurt, but much less. I'm not going to be making deliveries for the shop anymore. I can't. I have to try and stop him, Dad. His parents glanced at each other, shocked, with even more confusion evident in their expressions. After a moment, it was his mother who responded. To stop who? Trust me, you aren't ready to know, but believe me when I tell you that I have to try and stop him. I don't have a choice. His father shook his head. You always have a choice, son, no matter what. Dre raised his eyes to the sky and tried to hold back the tears that burned behind his eyes. Not always, Dad. Not always. The four of them fell into silence as they continued walking back towards Neridany. Without conversation to distract him, Dre found his mind wandering towards what had happened in the dungeon, but he forced himself to think of anything else. It took a while, but eventually a different memory took hold. He thought back to his sleep state, and the descriptor burned into the wall underneath the name of his class. Bearing the load so that others don't have to. Maybe it was referring to more than just the weight of the pack on his back.